Hello again, universe. Thanks for joining me for more of my rambling into the void. Just some more thoughts today, November 1st, 2023, as the Gaza war rumbles on between the IDF and Hamas, and the risk of a larger regional war just seems to be increasing. There's a tremendous amount of emotional content bubbling to the surface all over the place, emerging like a sort of a parallel rhetorical war raging across the social landscape, almost like a cultural echo of the ground war. There are lots of hotly debated topics like what differentiates anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism? What constitutes hate speech? Is censorship appropriate? If so, applied to whom? How might one publicly advocate for Palestinian civilians while still supporting Israeli sovereignty? What constitutes a war crime? When is it appropriate to investigate a war crime? These are all important questions with historical implications, and all of them seem to be projected against this very oversimplified binary choice landscape. Are you pro Palestinian or pro Israel? Are you with the colonizers or with the terrorists? But as these discussions devolve into yelling matches, protests, and even into violence, I wanted to discuss a few of the ways I'm trying myself to maintain clarity, especially because there is this ubiquitous smokescreen of propaganda from all over the place, intended, I think, to invoke emotional responses and to further obscure our normal sense-making abilities. There's lots of name calling, ad hominem attacks. There are attempts to discredit, to cancel, to blacklist. I'm sure you've seen it. In this context, there are some linguistic traps that I think warrant some special attention so that A, we might avoid falling prey to certain propagandistic manipulation, but also, if we recognize them, we might ourselves refrain from engaging in this in use of the same kind of loaded language against our enemies, perceived or otherwise. And because Palestinian Israeli history is such a tangle of divergent interpretations, for example, when do you start the clock? Is it 1917, 1967? Is it October 7th? So I want to ask you to do your best to refrain from picking a side and digging into a position. The closer you look into this stuff, the more complex it gets. That's true for people in Palestine and Israel, and it's true for impartial parties or just good faith students of history who just want to see an end to the violence. But there are these tripwires that can make parsing out objective truth even more difficult. Some are just words that, when spoken, evoke such feelings that a nuanced conversation afterward is virtually impossible. Consider the word terrorist. Terrorism, the terrorists, ISIS-like terrorists. Consider how easy it has always been to employ these kinds of words in the context of an occupation or a war when there's asymmetry in the power structure. And more importantly, what does that term allow? Isn't it true that a terrorist, by definition, has a diminished sense of value of human life? So the implication is that they are, at a minimum, pathological, and at worst, they're subhuman. I mean, I've heard credible allegations of terrorism applied to actions taken by Israeli settlers in the West Bank and by Palestinians. So, I mean, at least in this context, nobody has a monopoly. But more importantly, if someone is a terrorist, we allow for all the normal considerations of acceptable human treatment to be suspended so that they can be killed. Indeed, they should be killed. Sociopaths are anathema to civilization, right? They're animals. Terrorists, not people. They're hateful baby rapers, grandma torturers, hospital bombers. The use of the T word can be a kind of intellectual laziness on the part of on the person speaking it, or it can be an attempt to intentionally dehumanize. But please remember, it is always a morally loaded term. It's difficult to define, and it's almost entirely subjective when used. How about this? It is an uncontroversial historical fact that Menachem Begin, who was later Israeli prime minister, was widely considered a terrorist during the resistance against the British in Palestine in the 1940s. And there are plenty of other examples of groups who were once considered terrorists who went on to gain political legitimacy. Yasser Arafat, of course, but also Nelson Mandela. He was on the US terrorist watch list until 2008. And even if you personally have a crystal clear definition of terrorism that works without exception, It's still unhelpful in public discourse because most people don't have that kind of definition in mind when they hear it. So leave it out. It's unhelpful. Let's consider some other words that are probably unhelpful most of the time. Genocide, genocidal. It's a term that is getting inserted into the discourse very often right now. Indiscriminate killing is another. I have no doubt that there are both Israelis and Palestinians right now who are so enraged and terrified that they would be willing to engage in either one of those things. But I ask you to be judicious in how you use them. Hyperbole and incendiary language are simply counterproductive to fruitful conversation, especially if the desired outcome is peace. There are a lot more terms like these, and I ask you, please stay vigilant, try to identify them, try to refrain from using them, and do your best not to become reactive and to stop listening when you hear them. And one more propaganda trap before I let you go. I understand that while trying to keep a mental framework of all this complicated history, it's useful, maybe even necessary, to organize the world into regions, nations, organizations, ideologies, religions, etc. But try to stay mindful of the fact that these are necessarily imprecise categories when it comes to things like intention and choice. For example, to say Israel wants such and such is virtually meaningless. Hamas says so and so. There's no such thing as Israel's opinion. Hamas is made up of many individual people with as many points of view. Yes, some of them are violent extremists. Some of those are very religious. Some are secular. Some are bureaucrats. Some are administrators. Some Israelis are eager to expel the Palestinians out of Gaza right now by any means necessary and drive them into the sea. Others are desperately trying to convince their government to stop bombing Gaza. By keeping some of these very evocative phrases and ideas identified and in clear view, and by not generalizing points of view or opinions, we might be able to help turn down the volume of the discourse and perhaps hear the earnest opinion of the person next to us. It's the extreme fringe of any group that always makes the news. So it becomes really easy to say, these college students are anti-Semitic, when at a rally of hundreds, there may have been a few extremists saying horrible things, while the vast majority might have easily been saying things that were uncontroversial. We shouldn't allow any group to be painted with a broad brush, and even more importantly, we shouldn't allow any ideology to be betrayed or discarded out of hand because of its own hyperbolic fringe. As a matter of personal sanity, I'm still working from the framework that the vast majority of individual people in the world right now would go to great extremes to avoid killing a baby given the chance. And I maintain that assumption until I see evidence to the contrary. And even when confronted with the evidence of individual heinous acts, I won't condemn a whole nebulous organization as baby killers. Hamas beheads babies or Israel bombs children. They're both equally meaningless expressions, in spite of the truth of specific instances. So, stop the hate is not something to demand of others. Stopping the hate starts with your own internal monologue. And all of us are part of the zeitgeist. So, please don't disregard your own individual importance and don't be lazy. What you think, what you say, what you post, how you say it, it matters. It moves the dial, however imperceptibly, but it does. If you have to pick a side, you can always pick the side of humanity. But please, reject binary choices. They're almost always insufficient. Thanks for listening. Until next time.